And now I am very excited to be joined by four wonderful gentlemen from DP Review. If you guys know the site, you know exactly how knowledgeable these folks are, and we are here to talk kind of about the recent trends in gear and exactly where we've been, maybe a little bit about where we're going. And so I would love first to start out, guys, why don't you just introduce yourselves? Let's start right here and then go down the road.
Sure, I'm Dale Baskin. I'm one of the editors over at Digital Photography Review.
I'm Rishi Sanyal. I'm a deputy and technical editor at DP Review.
I'm Samuel Spencer, studio manager at DP Review.
I'm Richard Butler. I'm one of the senior reviewers at DP Review.
Fantastic. So the way that we're going to do this, we've got about four kind of main topics that we want to talk about throughout this hour that we're going to be here. So I would love it if you guys would join us in the chat room. There's a chat button that is directly above the video player. Jump in there, share your thoughts, and I can kind of read some of those as they come in. I'd also love to have your questions on the various topics that we are talking about as we go. So I'm going to be sort of moderating, but allowing these guys to share their expert opinions and thoughts on the various subjects. So the first one, guys, just in general, do we even need DSLRs anymore? We're seeing the mirrorless cameras and the Micro Four Thirds, this system kind of growing more and more, becoming really popular. So do we, as amateurs, as professionals, do we even need DSLRs anymore?
It's a good question. So yeah, DSLRs, as you can see, tend to be bigger than their mirrorless counterparts. But they do still offer some advantages over mirrorless cameras. First of all, there's the optical viewfinder. For those who like shooting with optical viewfinders, there still are some advantages in terms of shooting with the optical viewfinder, in terms of being able to see the scene as you see it, which can help for fast action stuff. It can also help in scenes that have a lot of contrast and dynamic range, where you might not be able to see that whole dynamic range through the electronic viewfinder or the LCD, but you can see it through the optical viewfinder. But probably the biggest arena where DSLRs are still for the most part better than their mirrorless counterparts is in autofocus. These DSLRs have an entirely separate module, so the light entering the lens actually bounces off of a mirror and then goes down into a autofocus module down usually at the bottom of the camera. And that module has an understanding of distance and depth, subject distance. So it can basically take a measurement and immediately figure out where to send the lens focus element to focus on that subject. So in that sense, these DSLRs tend to be faster at focusing, as well as continuously focusing on subjects moving around. So there's subjects moving towards the camera or away from the camera. They have these predictive autofocus algorithms that can kind of predict where that subject will be at the time the shutter is fired. So they're very good at autofocus. And mirrorless, however, is catching up. And what we're starting to see on mirrorless cameras are on-sensor phase detection elements. Basically, these are elements on the image sensor itself that understand distance and depth. So these cameras don't have that separate autofocus module. They actually just use their image sensor to focus. So typically they'll do that just by looking at the image on the sensor and finding the point of maximal sharpness. But with these on-sensor phase detection elements, they can also kind of understand how far away the subject is and jump to it. But they haven't quite caught up to the traditional modules in these DSLRs. First of all, these on-sensor elements that understand distance collect very little light. So, because they're basically masked halves of pixels. So because they collect very little light, they stop working in low light. And so in low light, it just reverts back to just this contrast detection AF, which hunts around to find the best focus. But one arena where the mirrorless cameras are actually really good at focus is that they can understand what to focus on, because there's an image sensor in there that's seeing the whole scene, and that image sensor can see faces, it can detect faces. If you identify that this is a subject I want to focus on, they can follow that subject around, because it's basically reading the entire image off the image sensor. So they're really good at what's known as subject tracking. In other words, automatically moving the autofocus point to stay on the subject that you initially selected. So in that sense, mirrorless has a potential advantage to offer. However, I mean, DSLRs aren't just staying steady either. They're, in fact, Nikons have had a separate metering sensor in the camera that also understands the scene. It's a low-resolution image sensor of sorts that can try to understand what you initially focused on and stick to that as well. Canon is introducing it in their cameras. They introduced it in the 1DX, actually, and now it's in the 7D Mark II and the upcoming 5DS and SR, a metering sensor that also sees the scene and tries to follow the subject that you initially selected.
So I think it's interesting in the context of what you've just presented here. We typically often tend to think of the DSLRs as the more professional or the more advanced cameras, and that gap is really narrowing. If we start looking at some of these mirrorless cameras, we're seeing that they're adopting some of the technologies or the performance characteristics that I think we're very used to with the DSLRs. And it's kind of ironic that we now see DSLRs going back and trying to implement features that are where the mirrorless cameras really have strengths, such as trying to identify the subject of the scene. You know, and if we acknowledge the fact that this camera was essentially designed around the concept of running film through it, you know, there's this design that they're now going back and having to modify to do some of the things that the mirrorless cameras can do. So I think that gap is definitely narrowing, and the distinction between a mirrored camera and a mirrorless camera is starting to get small very quickly.
Yeah, especially when you look at the fact that this kind of almost looks like a DSLR.
Yeah, it's scary how they do that, and I don't think that's an accident.
You know, that just reminded me, actually. Well, yeah, because it's a form factor that has worked, right? But a lot of people will walk into camera stores and pick up one of these guys and be like, "Where's the face detection? Why can't it automatically find faces and focus on it?" So this one actually can, using its metering sensor, but a lot of DSLRs actually can't, because they're not constantly seeing the scene on an image sensor and finding a face. The newer cameras can, but that's somewhere inherently mirrorless cameras, and your iPhone, for that matter, started off doing well.
Well, and in terms of what that perception is, I know Richard and I were having a conversation the other day about, you know, what people expect a camera to look like, particularly if you're a professional showing up for the job. You know, you don't show up for a tank battle with a handgun, to maybe use an analogy. And if you show up to, say, a wedding with something like this, and you're a wedding photographer, this may be perfectly adequate these days to accomplish the job, but there's this perception of your client that maybe it's not a serious camera. Yeah, you're not a pro if you have this. I know, Richard, I don't know if you have additional thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, the thing I found really enlightening was I was at a friend's wedding a few years ago, and the photographer covering the event, a chap called Martin Phelps, was using two big Nikon cameras for most of the actual ceremony itself. But during the reception, suddenly he pulled out a Fuji X100. And because it's a smaller, more discreet camera, he was able to sort of dart in and out and get all of these candid photos that I really don't think he would have been able to get if he'd have been just that bit more visible by having a huge DSLR held up in front of him. And you know, looking at the photos afterwards, I have no memories of him actually appearing during the reception, but the photos suggest that he was essentially everywhere. So although the perception is you need a DSLR to do certain jobs, there are times when actually a different type of camera may even let you do things that you can't do with a DSLR.
Exactly. And even with a DSLR, you know, in most cases, you got to look through the viewfinder. And if you're out shooting people, when you bring a huge camera like this up to your eye, that sort of puts the camera between you and a subject, it kind of makes the interaction a bit less candid. It makes them aware their photograph is being taken. And one of the advantages of mirrorless cameras is they're starting to put in electronic shutters that make zero noise whatsoever. And then if you combine that with something like a tilt screen, suddenly you can hold the camera down low and not bring it up to your eye and break any sort of interaction between you and your subject. And I've found with cameras like the A6000s and the XT1, I can shoot from the hip because the AF systems are so smart and can use face detection and things like that. I don't need to bring the camera up to my eye and make people aware that I'm shooting or anything like that. And then add in the silent shutter and in things like my sister's wedding ceremony coming up, I'm probably going to choose a camera with electronic shutter so that there's not shutter noises happening when they say, "And now you may kiss the bride," or anything like that.
Well, it's really fascinating hearing the discussion where the the technology is kind of coming together, whereas the perception is still kind of separating them for different uses. Natasha Gauthier-Lalonde and one other person were wondering, for someone that photographs running children, babies, and families most of the time, what do you recommend? Because that does kind of combine a lot of those issues where it sounds like mirrorless is getting really good at recognizing those moving and predictive movement, but then you're also dealing with that kind of wanting to hide. So what are your thoughts on that?
You know, it's a great question, and I think a couple of years ago, all of us probably would have looked to the center and thought DSLR immediately. And one of the trends we're seeing is these mirrorless cameras, in many cases, they're so much smaller and more compact, and yet carry a lot of that same functionality. And I'm thinking of the example of shooting running kids. You know, one of the things that would make a huge difference is really good face detection. If you've got a busy birthday party with cakes and clowns and whatever, and then there's kids, these mirrorless cameras have great face detection systems that can zero in on those kids very fast. And in some cases, and I'm pointing to this one right here, this is a camera by Samsung, it's the Samsung NX1, it's got screaming fast autofocus. So you're not going to miss a shot for lack of autofocus speed. So I think the variety of cameras that can accomplish the goal that you just described is so much wider than it was a couple of years ago. We're not limited to a subset. We really have a whole selection of different technologies that can get us there.
Well, I mean, actually, on that subject, that's exactly what I was trying to do over the Christmas vacation. I have a niece, and my fiance also has a niece, and so we just spent 2 weeks with these, 8-month, 9-month-old babies, and for fun, I took a D810 and an A6000 with me on that holiday to kind of try to pit the two against each other, which is a few years ago would have sounded crazy, but I love shooting fast prime, so I had a 35-1.4 on the D810 and a 24-1.8 on the A6000, and I was really trying to focus on these babies are just so erratic. I mean, you focus on them, they're moving back, forth, left, right, so they present one of the most challenging autofocus scenarios for cameras, and the great thing about cameras with subject tracking, which both the D810 and A6000 do pretty well, is that I would initiate focus on my niece's eye and then just have the camera follow my niece and her eye around and just automatically select the right AF point to stay on her. And it was pretty amazing at how the D810 is the Nikons have this mode called 3D tracking, which is basically three-dimensional tracking, so it'll automatically pick the right AF point on the X and Y 2D axis to stay on the subject and also track their depth, which is the three-dimensional part of it. But so will the A6000, and it's crazy how well the A6000 actually kept up. It would. Sometimes with the baby just crawling towards me, going across the frame, there were times the A6000 actually got me a slightly higher hit rate. However, as soon as the light levels dropped, and I'm talking about just even indoor lighting, not too low light, but just indoor lighting, this camera typically tends to slow down, and that's again because the on-sensor phase detection elements, not face detection, ends up not working in low light, and at that point it slows down, and there the DSLRs are going to have an advantage.
But then one of the intangibles you have when you compare two cameras like this is, especially with kids, the camera you have with you is the camera that's going to get the picture of your kids.
True, yeah.
And if you can get 90% of the functionality of that camera in a camera this size that will fit in a purse or a backpack, there's a lot going for it because you're going to have it when you need it.
Exactly.
Perfect. All right, so I think that we are, the time is flying. This is really great, actually. I really love this discussion. People in the chat rooms are getting a lot of discussion in here too, but I think that we want to go on and talk about something that has been really kind of revolutionizing a lot of the video, which is 4K video. This is something that just even a little bit ago wasn't on anything, and now it suddenly seems like everything has 4K video. So the question is, what is possible now that it is so ubiquitous?
Yeah, and I'm not even sure it's what is possible now that makes it so ubiquitous. To me, 4K is a little bit like the new megapixel race, but it's really not the new megapixel race. It's interesting when we compare this to how high-def video eventually made its way onto cameras like this. It was a fairly slow progression. We had 720, we had 1080, and those are kind of baby steps along the way to 4K. I think 4K appeared in some of these cameras faster than most of us anticipated. We knew it was coming, but the speed at which it showed up in DSLRs and mirrorless cameras and cell phones has really, really astounded us. But the neat thing is it really represents an interesting convergence between still photography and videography, which have evolved from very different places and are converging very quickly, and it's opening up new possibilities for how we use the cameras.
Right.
Just the other day, I was actually filming Richard in a video we were doing about a product, and we shot him, again, I'll point to this one because we happen to be using it, the Samsung NX1, and we were shooting 4K video out on the deck of our building while he talked about this camera, and I took it inside later and I started pulling single frames off of this video and realizing I could print these at 8x10. I could easily make 8x10 prints from a single frame grab. And if you think about the implications of that for the way people approach photography, could you potentially shoot sports in 4K video, and as long as you've got a fast enough shutter speed, potentially get usable frames where you could literally pick any frame from the entire video and publish it in your magazine. I mean, it really changes the definition of what a camera becomes.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about those shutter speed considerations for stills and video.
Yeah, so I mean, there is something of a tension between the two because if you're shooting sports and fast-moving action, you'll tend to want to use a nice fast shutter speed to ensure that you sort of freeze the action. However, in video, whether they realize it or not, most audiences are very, very sensitive to the shutter speed at which you shoot the footage. So if you shoot 24p footage, as a lot of, which is the way a lot of cinemas shot, you'll tend to use a shutter speed of 1/48th of a second, or around a 50th on a stills and movie camera. As soon as you start using the really fast shutter speeds that are required for sports, you can end up with very sort of staccato, almost stop motion-like video, which is
stylized like Saving Private Ryan or Gladiator, right?
Yeah, a stroboscopic effect, basically. Yeah.
So there is that hurdle to still overcome. Dale, I don't know whether you have any thoughts about whether that's just a creative choice or whether you think audiences will adapt to that look, or maybe there'll be a technological solution.
Well, it's interesting because I think some people in the film production business are trying to get audiences used to the idea of faster frame rates and shutter speed. And I know the classic is the recent Hobbit movies were filmed, I believe it was in 48 frames per second. Audiences actually didn't respond that well to it in a lot of places because we've been trained for 100 years that cinema looks a certain way. And it's amazing how doubling the frame rate and cutting the shutter speed in half really throws that off for us, and we suddenly feel like we're watching a soap opera. So I think there is a distinctive set of looks that we achieve to get with motion picture just for general acceptance of our audiences. Now, I think one of the things that's entirely possible is all of these cameras, they're just collecting data off the sensor, and there's nothing to say that we couldn't have cameras a few years from now that collect two different sets of data using electronic curtains, one which has fast shutter speed equivalents and one that has more cinematic shutter speed equivalents. And I'm potentially seeing a time when they could accomplish both
Or what they
from
could
the same
do
footage.
is you could pretty much in software algorithmically take high shutter speed shots and then look at the adjacent frames and figure out which way the motion is going and introduce motion blur into each frame to simulate a slower shutter speed.
It's entirely possible.
So I bet you someone's working on that.
Yeah, in fact, there's already applications that do that, and you can kind of tell if you're used to looking at motion that it's been interpolated motion, but this will only get better.
And already manufacturers are starting to include tools to help with grabbing stills out of 4K footage. Panasonic has what it calls a 4K photo mode, which I think biases towards using faster shutter speeds. It frees you from being stuck with a 16:9 aspect ratio, so you don't have to shoot everything widescreen, but it's still using effectively the 4K capability of the sensor to grab high resolution images really quickly. And then it's got a load of tools. You can, as you're shooting video, you can tap the shutter button to leave a marker for yourself. So when you're reviewing your footage, you think, okay, the key moment was around there somewhere. So I'll jump back to there, nudge one or two frames back. Yep, that's the shot I wanted, and hit OK, and it produces an image with full EXIF. So you've got all your shooting data there, which is another thing that's often missing.
I think one of the things that's really important to acknowledge when we talk about 4K, however, is that all 4K is not created equal.
Right.
I mean, it depends on what kind of bit rate you have, what kind of codec you're using, and there's a lot of different factors right down to the imaging sensor. And as a videographer who's done a lot of motion picture work and editing, I would much rather have really good high quality 1080 footage than mediocre 4K footage as my starting material. Now that said, we've got three cameras here, the Sony A7S, the Samsung NX1, and the Panasonic GH4, all of which can record 4K video in a very small, compact package, and they're outstanding. I mean, you're really not making much of a compromise. You know, it's not what you're going to get from a RED camera if you're shooting RED RAW and 10-bit video, but considering the cost to get into this and the size of the package, particularly the Sony a7S, it has a full-frame DSLR sensor. It's extremely light sensitive. I know Sam and I were testing it the other day in our lab, and you can get kind of usable 4K video recorded out to something like the Atomos Shogun at ISO 100,000. And it just blew us away to see that. And the funny thing is, we popped it up on screen. It looked good. We thought it was great, and then I realized I had it at a quarter resolution. And then we went back and looked at it at full resolution and realized it looked even better. So it's amazing that you're not making a lot of compromises to get good 4K video on these cameras.
It's a good time to mention also that, you know, you just said that all, 4K video is not created equal. Same goes for 1080p, actually. Just because you have a 1080p mode on your camera doesn't mean that it's actually recording video at the full 1080p resolution. A lot of the time what ends up happening is the camera reads every other line of the sensor, and so you get lower effective resolution and worse noise performance because you're literally collecting less light. But these guys, if I remember correctly, they're always reading the full sensor, right? And so it's the image quality in video on these three particular cameras is just astounding.
It's stunning.
It's good to see manufacturers really trying to read the whole sensor and get the high resolution, low noise performance.
I would like to mention one danger of 4K that I've come across, though. Space.
Yes.
Yeah.
30 seconds is over a gigabyte on some of these cameras. I remember the 1DC was just a monster, and you had to buy very expensive compact flash cards to get it to work and things like that. And so it's a question of, is it better in a situation to be shooting stills, or is it better to be having the ability to pull your frame later on? Because when you do that, you're going to use up a whole heck of a lot of data in a very short period of time.
Well, and to your point, the Shogun here, the Atomos Shogun, it records direct to SSD drives. You can put a terabyte SSD drive in here, and if you're recording out to 4K ProRes, you're talking about 500 megabit per second data rate.
Yeah, and we've got, a question
fast.
from Bob Ray, and a couple other people also wanted to know, photographers are focused on capturing the defining moment. With the ability of the new 4K cameras to pull high-resolution still images from its video captures, are DSLRs and portrait shooters facing a huge change? And so I think the theory that a lot of people are seeing as they hear about this ability is that people are just going to stick their camera out, walk through the event for a few hours to record the whole wedding, and then just pull out the images. So what should people be scared about this? Should still photographers be scared about this? Should they be excited? And the data considerations, especially, how do those factor into that?
I'd say absolutely no. You shouldn't be frightened of this. This is an opportunity. And also, I think anyone who's shooting professionally will realize the moment doesn't necessarily happen unless you put yourself in the right position, unless you've engaged with the subject in the right way.
You still need to create the conditions that give you the moment, and
Absolutely.
a good photographer knows how to do that.
Yeah, and compositionally, you have to think about it. You have to, actually, before we even see the ability to just pull any still out of a 4K video, the autofocus capabilities are going to have to advance as well to make sure that you can, that you're nailing focus as you're taking the 4K video. And technologies like on-sensor phase detection, as well as Canon's dual pixel AF, which we see in the 70D and the 70D Mark II, technologies like that are really going to help because the dual pixel AF allows you to continuously focus as you're recording video, and it does so very well. So that's going to be.
And I think if we think back to when autofocus was first introduced on SLRs, there was a concern that suddenly, now suddenly everyone can be a sports photographer. Well, no amount of technology has suddenly allowed everyone to be a sports photographer. There's still all sorts of skills that no amount of technology can suddenly replace.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, I was going to say, but to give us an idea of where we're going, and I know this is something that we talked about before the show started, if you look at the high-end cinema cameras today, say a Red Epic Dragon, I don't remember the exact specs off the top of my head, but you're able to capture roughly 120 frames per second at 6K, and each individual frame shooting in the Red RAW format gives you about a 20 megapixel RAW, not a JPEG, but a 20 megapixel RAW file that you can push and pull and modify just like you can a raw single file from any of these cameras. And when you're talking about that kind of potential, that's a game-changing technology.
Right.
But if you look at all of the cameras we have here, particularly the ones that shoot 4K video, we're really looking at a feature set that was the high-end cinema cameras just a few years ago that would have cost tens of thousands of dollars. And so I'm very excited about these changes because we can literally see the future. It is there now. It's just not migrated down to the types of cameras that we're dealing with here.
So where do you see that then? What are we looking at when we see the tens of thousands of dollars cameras? What are the features that you do foresee coming to the prosumer professional market soon?
You know, I think one thing that videographers are constantly banging on these companies for is not necessarily higher resolution, but better color depth, better compression codecs, saving space, to Sam's point. You know, generally, one of the things you give up when you're shooting 4K video on a camera like this is you're really getting 8-bit color. Essentially what you're getting is a stream of JPEG images, oftentimes with a keyframe, you know, every so many frames, sometimes all intra, but you don't have the ability to go in and edit the footage like you could a raw file from a single frame in most of these cameras. Once that ability comes along, it really opens the doors to really easy post-processing. The danger now is if we don't get it right, if we get the color balance off, if the exposure is off, you've essentially cooked the result into your footage and it's hard to change.
But that's also just a sort of a computational problem. Basically, one of the things that has enabled 4K and smaller cameras is, you know, good heat dissipation and processing power to be able to just handle all that data. Also read the sensor really quickly over and over again. So all these things will be solved as we see increases in computational power, and then, you know, we might even get like full raw streams in video recorded where you can do all the things you do with raw stills.
Next subject, you actually mentioned it earlier, is the megapixel race. We're seeing more and more cameras just increasing the number of megapixels, and that's a good thing to put on the box. But among photographers, a lot of people see that as basically leading to a loss of quality. More megapixels equals lower image quality. So question is, if that's so, why do we constantly see more and more megapixels being added?
Well, first of all, it's just not true.
So that's a problem.
The megapixel myth, as it's called, is it's this idea that image quality decreases with increasing resolution of sensors it's just not true. If you think about the fact that a 24 megapixel APS-C sensor, like the one in the A6000, equates to a higher than like around 54 megapixel full frame sensor, then you start to realize that you know, these high resolution full frame sensors are not that, it's not that high of a pixel density, because we're already seeing that sort of pixel density in an A6000. A D810 36 megapixel full frame sensor is essentially a 36 megapixel full frame camera and a 16 megapixel APS-C camera in one. So there are all these advantages to having those extra pixels in terms of cropping ability, in terms of printing large. And this idea that the higher megapixel images are noisier, it's a little misleading, because yes, at the pixel level, a high resolution camera might look noisier than a lower resolution camera, but we don't view images at the pixel level, right? We view them either scaled to your monitor, either as a print, so we view them what we call normalized. So if you take a 36 megapixel full frame image and a 16 megapixel full frame image, and then you view them at the same exact size, they're not going to be really much, if any, disadvantages to the 36 megapixel image, because when you resample and downsize that image to the same resolution as a lower resolution full frame sensor, you basically automatically do some noise reduction. And ultimately, it's the size of the sensor that matters the most, because how noisy an image is basically depends on how much light you collected. And so a larger sensor collects more light than a smaller sensor, so it's really the sensor size that matters. And if you have a high resolution full frame sensor and a low resolution full frame sensor, they both almost capture the same amount of light because of technologies in the micro lenses on the pixel that try to get as much light into the pixels as possible. So even if you have more pixels, these sensors have these technologies that allow you to still capture almost the same amount of total light as a lower resolution full frame sensor will allow you to capture. So I'm all for more pixels. You know, the 5DS, 5DS are 53 megapixel CMOS sensors that give you 50.6 megapixels of effective resolution. Again, there you have a 50 megapixel full frame and a 22.5 megapixel APS-C camera in one. And I think it's great. The only thing that really actually, one of the trade-offs here is the higher resolution sensor, the more data you're collecting, and the more processing power you need. You know, it's difficult to read out all those pixels really quickly, so you are going to pay some frame rate costs in that sense. But
And some, again, space issues, data space.
Yeah.
Really, I mean, people talk a lot about the megapixel race. So I did a quick look at when the pixel counts of different sensor sizes increased. And if you plot a trend line through them, you realize that actually we're pretty much, with the exception of maybe the 4/3 size sensor, we're pretty much on trend. The megapixel race has never stopped. There's never been a lull. We're still exactly where you'd expect us to be in terms of trend. The improvements in sensor technology have meant that each year we can make sensors with similar or better performance, but with more pixels. And when Rishi was saying that the new 5D S&R from Canon will be sort of 50 megapixel full frame sensors, but you could also think of them as being a 22 megapixel APS-C, well, that's basically a 7D Mark II. So if you take the same image side by side and they've got the same pixel level performance, then the one with the larger sensor, when you scale it down to view them at the same size, to normalize them, will be cleaner. Right. So yeah, there's a perception that the megapixel race has stopped. It just hasn't. But also, you know, but this is nothing necessarily to fear.
So as the sensors increase, as the high pixel counts increase, it seems like other aspects of the camera need to be changed as well. So what are some of the other things around the sensor that are being affected by that high pixel count?
Well, at our studio scene, Richard told me a story about when the D800E first came out, 36 megapixels and things like that. Our studio scene is lit with continuous light. And so during the tests, you know, we're doing longer shutter speeds to get the exposures correct at lower ISOs. And there was a problem with shutter shock on that camera. And they ended up having to light the studio scene with strobes to get it at maximum sharpness. The D810 came out and introduced things like mirror lockup and electronic front curtain shutter, where the shutter moves out of the way and the exposure is initiated electronically to prevent any of the movement or anything like that from vibrating the sensor, because we did a test on it actually last week and showed that both the mirror and the shutter can impact sharpness when you're at such high resolutions. And so we'll see how Canon does when the 52 megapixel sensor comes out.
So camera manufacturers are also addressing this by putting in technologies like the D810 has a redesigned mirror mechanism to try and help the mirror shock, or whatever you want to call it. The 7D Mark II from Canon, as well as the 5DS and 5DSR, have a different mirror mechanism as well that is motor driven. So the idea here is to try to lessen the impact of that mirror going up and hitting the top and shaking your entire camera and shaking your image. Also, Canon has introduced a number of what they're calling pre-delays, which is basically you can set different pre-delays, 1/8 of a second, 1/4 of a second, half a second. Nikon also has its exposure delay, which you can set 1 or 2 or 3 second delays. Basically what that does is it introduces a delay between the mirror going up and the shutter firing. So that allows the vibrations from the mirror to dampen before the shutter is fired. But even then, that's not always enough, which is why the D810 introduced the electronic front curtain. So that gets rid of both the mirror as well as a mechanical shutter. So instead of having a mechanical shutter open to initiate the exposure, the shutter goes up with the mirror, and then the exposure is initiated electronically. And the Canons can do that as well in live view. So there are all these things that camera manufacturers have to do to ensure that you're getting the most out of that high resolution sensor. Otherwise, you know, why even make the high resolution sensor if you're just going to blur the image?
And while we're discussing the mirror needing to move out of the way, that might lead one to think that mirrorless then would have an advantage. But the A7R, which is also 36 megapixels,
Megapixels.
I'm surprised we got this
36
far without anyone screwing that up.
let me try that again. 36 megapixel sensor. It still has shutter shock issues, and they haven't introduced things like electronic front curtain or anything like that for that camera.
On that, in the A7R at least.
But I think what's worth noting is that the higher megapixel count in itself doesn't introduce these problems.
That's a really good point.
Internal shake hasn't suddenly become a problem, or at least hasn't become any more of a problem. And equally, the demands on lenses aren't becoming any higher. The problem is that we're seeing any flaw or any vibration in much greater detail. So the challenge really is being able to see the value of those extra megapixels, because otherwise they will highlight all the inherent problems that you just couldn't, you weren't looking in close enough detail to see before.
That's a really good point, because it's if you, again, normalization, like what I was saying with noise, if you then downscale the image back to like a 20 megapixel image, it's not going to look any worse because of shutter shock than a 20 megapixel camera would have. It's just that we can see it at the full 36 megapixels pixel level detail. And at that point, you notice things like shutter shock and lower resolving power lenses. And actually, I wanted to finish this thought that Sam brought up, which is the A7R and these mirrorless cameras. So the A7R would be fine if it, again, electronically initiated its exposure, which a lot of mirrorless cameras actually do. So it's here, actually, mirrorless cameras have a potential advantage because they don't have a mirror to flip out of the way. You've removed that from the equation as a potential source of shake. So it almost behooves mirrorless cameras to take advantage of that and get rid of the mechanical shutter and always initiate electronically, because that way there's no source of shake when you initiate the exposure. And in that sense, the mirrorless cameras, again, have a potential advantage.
Great.
And besides, we love silent modes.
Yeah, I mean, this is
Going
like
stealth. It's great.
I mean, this is not just an electronic first curtain. You have to have actually two curtains, as you call it, one to start the exposure and one to end the exposure. Most mirrorless cameras we've seen have an electronic first curtain, so it doesn't use a shutter to initiate, so there's no source of shake. But they still use the shutter to end the exposure, which is okay. You can shake the camera all you want at the end of the exposure. But this guy actually has electronic on both, so I just took a photo. Wow. Just took a photo, and you can't even hear it.
Which, by the way, is scary close to how motion picture works, right?
Yeah.
The shutter does not go up and down between each frame.
Yeah.
So.
That's amazing. So when we were talking a little bit before this, you guys told me a little bit how this affects how you actually have to test these cameras. Do you want to talk just briefly about that? Because it was kind of funny to me.
Yeah,
just how sensitive they are.
Normally it's single shot with a 2-second timer and everything like that, so that you don't bump the camera and everything like that. D810, you have to turn on electronic front curtain shutter, and you have to turn on the 2-second delay so that the mirror flips out of the way and it waits before moving the shutter out of the way and then initiating the exposure. So there's a big list of settings that you got to make sure that you have set on a D810 to really get maximum sharpness when you're on a tripod shooting a studio scene with a dragged shutter.
And indeed, using a good quality heavy tripod, sometimes weighted down. The camera stand we were using previously simply wasn't stable enough to absorb and to lock the camera down and help to prevent this vibration sort of propagating through the camera. So they're pretty challenging things to get the most out of.
Challenging given we're on the 10th floor of a building in what is arguably the most exciting construction zone in the city of Seattle.
So much. You guys are just basically around the corner from us, and there are 5 cranes within a stone's throw distance. So you get that. I mean, you were mentioning like somebody flushes a toilet on the wrong floor,
Right.
and suddenly it's affecting the way that you're perceiving the image.
Exactly. When we were doing the shutter shock test, we were using a long 200 millimeter lens in the back of the studio on the A7R. And I was standing behind it, watching the rear screen, hands off the camera and everything like that, and there's just still constant little vibrations from HVAC system, construction, who knows what. But in terms of changing the way we have to test cameras, it's also in ways changing the equipment that we have to use. The Olympus OMD EM52 introduced a 40 megapixel sensor shift mode, and we try to standardize the lenses that we use in our studio scene. And so in that mode, we use the Olympus 45mm 1.8 prime. It's a great lens, very affordable. But in the 40 megapixel mode, it seemed a little soft. And so then we pulled out a unicorn of a lens that costs somewhere in the absurd realm of over $1,000 for micro four thirds that produced a beautiful shot. And so it's changing the equipment that we have to use too, which could change if somebody wants to use that mode in the real world. Somebody who can't afford like a Nocticron unicorn.
Well, it's challenging us on the video side as well, because our studio scene historically has been, what can we point a high resolution megapixel camera at that we can start to discern tiny details? Well, with 1080 video, the whole thing is blurry, right? So 4K is starting to get closer, but we're now having to start to think, how do we test the resolution of something like 4K video when it's really a different set of problems that are being solved in every frame.
It's also interesting because, we also don't want to just do a completely lab test that is irrelevant to real-world usage, right? Like the fact that with this camera, I have to make sure we have no source of shake, we have to put it in this mode where the first button press locks up the mirror, second button press initiates a delay, and then it fires electronically, and then stops with the mechanical shutter. That's not really a way a person's going to use this in the real world, right? So we are
Anticipate the action.
yeah. So we're one of the tests we're doing now is actually testing all these modes and testing them at a whole bunch of different shutter speeds to try to give you an idea of what kind of shutter speed you need to avoid these sources of shake if you want to maximize your image quality and resolution. And typically, people are used to this whole 1 over focal length shutter speed rule. And with cameras of this resolution, we're finding, not very surprisingly, that you have to use a higher shutter speed than just following the 1 over f focal length rule. And that's valuable information we're getting out of these sorts of tests to try to help people figure out what they should do in the real world to maximize the sharpness out of these cameras.
I think one of the things that is important to remember is we, and when I say we, I don't mean us, but I mean everyone who's a consumer of cameras, is to a certain degree spoiled by how good cameras have become. And honestly, every camera on this table is a great camera if you're using it for the right thing. And so one of the ways we need to adapt our testing to make the tests more relevant is to get out, do more in the real world. A great example, we've been testing the EM5 II down there that Richard has. We went out last week and Richard did a bunch of mountain biking and we tested the camera in real world conditions with different kinds of optics, different types of support, and we're trying to give a more real world example of how the camera works in the field.
Because I think both have their value. It's good to know the technical limitations, the exact technical specs, but then how does that apply to me when I'm out shooting my niece?
Yeah, and by the way, if you want to see Richard mountain biking, and I understand it's a very good mountain bike too, go to dpreview.com and it should be near the top of the page right now.
Perfect. I got a couple quick questions that I want to hit just on general subjects before we move into kind of our final wrap up. First of all, this camera that Richie, you were holding up that was the almost completely silent one, Christine Serto was wondering which one that was.
That is the Sony A7S.
Sony A7S. There you go, Christine.
But equally, there are quite a few of the current generation of mirrorless cameras do have a full electronic shutter mode, so it can be operated totally silently.
So there's the
the EM5 II, the X100T, I believe.
The XT1 Graphite Edition introduced the electronic shutter mode.
in both open and closing.
Yeah, completely silent.
One thing to keep in mind, though, actually, this is something we're trying to look into too, is that when you do use a fully electronic shutter for both initiating and ending your exposure, we have noticed in some cases, I know with the A7S, you actually increase your noise levels. So if you're looking for the lowest noise, low light performance, you might not want to be shooting in fully electronic curtain mode.
Good to know. Okay, a couple just kind of quick ones. I know that obviously people can go to dpreview.com to check out in-depth reviews on some of these. Gersher wants to know some of your thoughts on the Canon 5DS and 5DS-R, which has, of course, the 50.6 megapixel sensor. When do you think it's suitable to change to those types of high pixel cameras?
You guys have seen it, so. Yeah.
Suitable to change to those resolution cameras?
Yeah, what is it that would make you want to advance to that level?
Well, I find that the high resolution counts really help in when you go to post-process your files. There are times where I want to actually crop, rotate, change my field of view a little bit, and having the extra pixels really helps because you get a high resolution image in the end, even after you've significantly cropped. Secondly, I like to print large. So, especially when you shoot landscapes, landscape photographers will literally go to the same spot 100 times or more until you get that one perfect sunrise or sunset with the amazing lighting, because that's just not something you can create in Photoshop. The really nice lighting and those conditions. And, after all that effort to get that one shot, you really don't want to go back, months or years later and be like, oh man, I wish that were a little higher resolution so that I could, print that larger. And so it's just nice to have that data. I mean, as we go forward to this realm of computational photography where you capture a lot of rich data and then you create the image you want out of it, the more information you start off with, the better. Just the more flexibility you have, the more future-proof it is. And
even if you're not using the full resolution at its native size, if you downscale it, you're essentially oversampling the scene, which means you're likely to be, you've captured more data, but also it reduces the risk of error, of moire, of other aberrations that are going to impact your image. So since the technology allows you to do it, I mean, there are some kinds of photography that will particularly benefit from the resolution now, but since the technology is available that you can shoot at these resolutions, well, why not?
Yeah. And when you're cropping, it also gives you the ability to, if you're shooting something very small and you have a razor thin depth of field, even at 5.6, which is in many cases the limit of diffraction, you wouldn't want to stop down too much further or you'd start losing sharpness. It gives you the ability to pull out and increase your depth of field and then crop in on something really small without having to stop down so far that you start to lose sharpness.
It's like you get your lenses actually get extra reach because you can crop, as long as your lenses actually do have very high resolving power and allow you to get the detail out of those pixels.
Let's talk a little bit about the recent past and the near future. So first of all, would love for each of you to kind of share what's there's been a lot of cameras that have been released in the past couple months, maybe the last quarter or so. What's your favorite? What do you like about it in the last couple months? Maybe we'll go down the line each of you.
Yeah, to start at this end?
Sure.
Yeah, I could probably pick half the cameras on this table that I'm really excited about. But one that really, really jumps out at me, and partially because I've been testing it the last couple of months, is this camera here. This is the Samsung NX1. And it's kind of interesting for me to shoot the Samsung because I think I'm like a lot of photographers. I don't historically associate Samsung with high-end professional quality cameras. And this is really the first one I've used after using most of the other types on the table here. And it's interesting what Samsung has done with this. They've put a stake in the ground and they've basically tried to best every other camera on this table in every category in which it competes. Whether it's the fast autofocus, it shoots 15 frames per second in continuous shooting mode. It has amazing 4K video. And I'm not convinced yet that it actually does better in every category than every camera on this table. But considering that this is a relatively new business for Samsung, and they've jumped into it 2 feet first into the pool, this is a very impressive camera. And they've got some very nice optics that go along with it. So the Samsung NX1, if you haven't shot with Samsung cameras before and you're doubtful, I would say it's worth the effort to go down to a camera shop, pick one up and try it because you may be impressed.
That's awesome.
And coming up is the NX500.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Which is going to offer a lot of that in a smaller, mirrorless style of experience. Because you're quite often confusing that with a DSLR practically because its form factor is so similar.
It's worth noting that we've mentioned this in the context of a DSLR. And I didn't even think to mention that it's a mirrorless camera because I treat it like a DSLR.
Right. Well, the form factor, it looks like one.
The form factor is very good, but one of the things that really stands out about this camera is the electronic viewfinder is hands down one of the best I've used. Okay. And I think there's been challenges with EVFs or electronic viewfinders as they've evolved over time, the thing that makes this one amazing, other than the fact that it's just really bright and crisp, is there's essentially zero lag. So the effect that we're used to on electronic viewfinders for what's going on out there and what's going on up at your eye are separated by a significant portion of time. This doesn't happen on this camera, and so it just feels like you're looking not quite through an optical viewfinder, but a close enough approximation that you really stop worrying about it.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I would actually say, even though I personally own a D810, and I love its resolution and dynamic range, probably one of the cameras I'm most excited about in terms of a very well-rounded camera that a lot of people will appreciate is the Nikon D750. And this is a full-frame DSLR and a pretty small body, as you can see. And it has just a fantastic 24 megapixel sensor in here with incredible dynamic range, incredible low light performance, and its autofocus system is fantastic. It's one of those systems that combines a traditional phase detection AF module here in the bottom of the camera along with data from a 91,000 pixel metering sensor that understands the scene and it can do face detection, and it can track your subjects really well and automatically pick one of its 51 AF points to just stick to your subject, which works really well for shooting fast primes, including probably my favorite lens, which is the Sigma 35 f1.4 lens on there, just to get those sharp shots in focus even at f1.4. It's a very well-rounded camera. Its autofocus system works down, every single point works down to -3 EV, so it's very, very low light. So it'll continue to focus in low light, and yeah, it's just a fantastically well-rounded camera.
That's great.
This is a camera that I both love and hate. I love the X100 system. It's a beautiful, classic, well-made, simple, enjoyable to use camera. And I own an X100S, which is why I hate the X100T. Because every little thing that I could complain about on the X100S was addressed and made better with the X100T. And that's what makes it so great. It took a great experience and just improved it just the right amount. It fixed problems with focusing using the brilliant optical viewfinder by introducing that little rangefinder window, quote unquote, that pops up, and just nicer controls and everything like that, and it just makes me mad that I bought the X100S too soon.
And for anyone that's maybe not as familiar with the model names, that's the Fujifilm
Yes.
X100.
Sorry, yes, I forgot to mention Fuji there.
And actually, I was tempted to fight Sam for the X100T because it is a lovely camera to use. But for the last couple of weeks, I've been shooting with the Olympus OMD EM5 II. And the thing that catches everyone's eye is it offers a 40 megapixel mode. So although it's only got a 16 megapixel sensor, it can rattle through 8 different positions. It'll shoot 8 shots in very quick succession, and then combine those images to produce a very high resolution single image. So 40 megapixels in JPEG, 64 megapixels in RAW. But weirdly, actually, that's the thing I find least interesting about the camera. I mean, it's an incredibly clever mode, and there are certain types of photography, particularly studio and landscape work, that's great for. But actually, the thing I like about it is very much like the X100T. Olympus has gone back and looked at the EM5 and looked at what users were asking for, looked at what they could polish compared to the existing camera. So whether it's the fact it just feels that bit more solid in my hand, whether it's the fact it now has a microphone socket and a flip-out monitor and can shoot much better quality video, little tweaks to the options available for the different function buttons. Everything has just been tweaked and polished and improved. And the viewfinder, very much like the one in the NX1, it's much higher resolution, very fast refresh rate. Just everything is being made that bit nicer. And I really like the EM5. So the EM5 II, it's going to take something to get it out of my hands, to be honest.
That's great. Yeah, now I'm kind of feeling like Sam because I bought the EM5 within the past 6 months, and I'm kind of annoyed at myself. That's okay.
But have you enjoyed those 6 months?
I've loved it. It's been a fantastic camera. So. Yeah. So for those of us who do want to have a little bit of sadness as far as what we've bought recently, let's talk about what is coming out soon. Love to hear what you guys are looking forward to the most. Maybe this is kind of our final question before we do a little bit of promo of some other exciting opportunities.
Sure. Well, I think one that I'm very excited about, and again, having been working with the Samsung NX1 here a lot recently, I keep referring to it as a DSLR because it really is a big DSLR type camera,
Right.
and it's great for that. But one of the standout features of this camera is its amazing video quality. What's coming out is the Samsung NX, is it the 500? The NX 500, which is essentially this camera, but in a smaller form factor. It doesn't have the optical viewfinder and the mirror prism faux bump here. It's a much smaller package, probably more on par with maybe something like the Sony camera, possibly even smaller than that. And yet it has all of those capabilities for shooting high-res 4K video that make this camera so attractive for a videographer.
And there's a big price difference between the
Huge
two.
price difference, right. And I think the NX 500 is around $800. Is that?
I forget, but one difference is you can't stream 4K video out to an external recorder. The elephant in the room, or rather
That's
the black
true.
object on the desk, is the
Yeah, the thing that looks like a big GPS unit is actually, I think we mentioned it earlier, but this is an Atomos Shogun, which can record 4K video out from the cameras, and a lot of them actually do give like better color or better bit rate when they feed out to the external recorder. So.
You know, I'm probably most excited right now by what we're hoping to see from Sony. You can read the rumor mills to kind of guess at what's coming next. That's all we know as far as we know too. But what we've seen from Sony recently has been really impressive. They're really, they're trying to bite into the market, right? That is dominated by Canon and Nikon, and Sony's been doing a lot to try to offer a lot to the photographers. And so this is the A7 II here, and it's a full frame camera with in-body image stabilization in a package this small. So we're hoping, hopefully, to see this in future cameras from Sony. And this camera itself is a real. It's just fantastic in the fact that it offers full frame image quality in something this small. I love a lot of types of photography, but I mainly like landscapes and wedding photography. And so I want a camera that can kind of do a lot. So focus really well as have a lot of dynamic range and a really good quality sensor. And also I like to travel, and I want something that's small. So basically I want it all. And this, it's really what they're trying to do here. Sony's autofocus technologies that they're iterating on are really fantastic, and we're seeing that in here too, where it uses that image sensor to try to understand what to focus on, and then uses on-sensor phase detection elements to quickly go and focus on them. And the improvements they're making there that we see actually in the A6000, what Sony's calling 4D focus, which is really just 3D focus, continuous, in continuous mode, is really impressive. And if they can solve the problem of being able to continue to focus in low light, I think we're going to be very excited by what they're going to make in the future.
Well, and we as consumers only win when more people can enter that race and really start challenging each other to do more and better with Samsung and Sony.
They're forced to innovate.
Stepping up. Yeah, it's fantastic. Yeah.
I'm really excited about the Canon 5DS and SR, but not necessarily because I'm excited about 50 megapixels or anything like that. I'm more excited about getting to use some of the new Canon glass that's coming out too. I've been using the 16 to 35 IS lens, and it's a massive improvement over the old one. The old one was really mostly only usable in the center. As you got to the edges, it went bad, but this one, they fixed that and they added a really brilliant IS system. I got a sharp shot at 1/3 of a second the other day, handheld, which is just unheard of. And then they also have the 11 to 24 2.8, is it?
Yeah,
it's an f4 as well, but incredibly wide, and I'm sure that's going to be a beautiful lens as well. And I shot Canon at my previous job for a number of years, and I picked up the 7D Mark II recently with that lovely little 24 millimeter pancake on it. And, it just felt really good to use Canon again. So I'm really excited to kind of see if, how things go for them this year.
That's great.
I think for me, it's probably going to be the long-promised Pentax full-frame camera. Pentax has a history of making really nice photographers' cameras, with really well-positioned controls. They take a very sort of traditional approach to the design of their cameras. And frankly, any competition, any additional competition in the full frame space, I think is interesting. And also, it's nice to see a company responding to its user base, because a lot of people have been asking for a full frame Pentax DSLR for a long time. So it's good to see that under the new owner's Ricoh that's going to happen. But I think, to be honest, if you look at any of these systems, I really enjoy the Fujifilm X series. I'm quite a big fan of Micro Four Thirds. A lot of manufacturers have been doing really interesting things, and each generation has been better than the last. Whether it's in terms of the lenses, that are promised on roadmaps, or wow, well, what's the next generation of this technology going to look like? I think there are going to be, the cameras that we have today are better than they've ever been. But tomorrow, I mean...
That's fantastic. All right, well, I want to thank everybody for coming here. It's been great hearing all your very, very knowledgeable thoughts on this. Maybe let's talk briefly just about the site. Maybe tell folks where they can go to find you guys and even more info from you.
Sure. Well, I think the obvious place is go to www.dpreview.com. It's digital photography review. I believe we are the world's biggest camera website. There's discussion forums, there's news articles, there's camera reviews. Have I missed anything, guys? I mean, we have... Well, for all the questions we got, we had a lot of people coming in and asking, should I get this one or this one? For this thing, should I get this one? That's where you guys go. They do an amazing job at that.